In this first part, we go briefly through how to start using ChatGPT Plus and OpenAI API.
Activation is done from the OpenAI.com website by selecting Try ChatGPT. This will automatically take you to a page where you choose between login and sign up. If you are already registered, select Login. If it's your first time, select Sign up. After this, you choose your login method. If you are logging in with email, you'll continue by entering your password, which will then be used for future logins. Alternatively, you can also log in using Microsoft or Google accounts. After logging in, ChatGPT is available for use. The screen is dominated by instructions and warnings. Your own prompt is written in the Send Message field. We will talk more about prompts and their specific use in the next section. The conversation you have with ChatGPT, along with its responses, appears at the top of the screen. On the side of the screen is a list of past conversations, which are saved unless deleted. At this point, it is crucial to remember not to include any confidential information in your prompts unless you have agreed with OpenAI that your conversations data won't be used for teaching the AI. ChatGPT use is free of charge, but often unavailable due to overcrowding. The newest features are first introduced to the paid ChatGPT Plus version. You can activate ChatGPT Plus by selecting Upgrade to Plus, after which the system will ask for billing information. The cost is $20 per month plus VAT. If the cost will be borne by an organization, it is advisable to check the associated box and fill in the requested company information. The amount will then be tax deductible. The organization is also significant in that with a code associated with the organization, one can easily request OpenAI not to use the conversations as teaching material. After entering the payment information, ChatGPT switches the user interface to the ChatGPT Plus interface. In the ChatGPT Plus version, the warnings aimed at first-time users have been moved to the startup. You can choose between GPT 3.5 and GPT4 models. GPT4 has a limit. You can't use more than 25 prompts in any 3-hour period. Conversations held with the earlier free version are saved, and you can continue them if you wish, assuming you are okay with those discussions being used as teaching materials for OpenAI. If you forbid the use of the discussions as learning material, they will not be saved. This prohibition is done by clicking the 3 dots next to your name, selecting Settings, and then Data Controls. The OpenAI API is primarily an environment intended for developers and researchers. In addition to the language model, there is also a program interface for DALL-E image making service and Whisper's speech recognition service. It's mainly intended for program developers. However, there are many advantages for other organizational users as well, so signing up for it should be seriously considered. On OpenAI's website, you register as a developer through sign up, and account management requires two-factor authentication. The organization logs in as a developer in the name of the main user. The main user provides the organization's information along with payment method details. The main user can then invite members of their organization, project, or initiative as users. The cost incurred by these invited users will be billed to the organization. The main user doesn't see what the invited users are doing, but can view the account's total consumption, set a maximum for it, and see on a daily basis how much each user has contributed to the daily load. The OpenAI's API is therefore the route through which programmers can test and connect their applications to use OpenAI's services. GPT-3 and GPT4 models, speech-to-text service, plugin integrations, and image-making service. For non-programming users, the API page also contains a lot of useful information. The examples and documentation tabs provide useful examples and tips. However, the main point for non-programming users is the playground. By default, the playground is in complete mode. This means that the text in the input window is sent as input when the submit command is used, and the selected model, in this case Text DaVinci 3, roughly the same as GPT 3.5, completes the text. This isn't a forced dialogue, but a continuation of any given text. You can edit the text in the input window as desired, and the model will continue from it upon each submit click, provided there is space. The maximum length is determined by the model and the maximum length setting. Other important settings include temperature, which determines the degree of randomness. A value of 0 is the most truthful, but the least creative. With the best of setting, you can ask the model to try several times and choose the best output. Additionally, you can reduce repetition and ask the model to display the probability of responses. Low probabilities indicate that the model doesn't have a clue about what it's talking about. In addition to the complete option, you can select chat, edit, and insert modes. Chat corresponds to the ChatGPT Plus mode, and if you have received permission for GPT4 use, it is selectable along with GPT 3.5. Unlike ChatGPT, this mode allows you to separately describe the role of the AI. The significance of the role description will be discussed in the next chapter, but here it has its own specific place, affecting the system level across the entire conversation. In insert mode, you can use the insert symbol to indicate a place in the input window text where the model adds text. In edit mode, you can provide input text and an editing instruction which the model follows to correct the given text.
Next, we will proceed to practical examples, different ways on how GPT-4 can be used.
In this chapter, we describe prompt-guided steering for various text production needs. We use GPT-4, ChatGPT Plus, and the OpenAI API as examples. We do not focus on technical usage except for the section concerning programming use. The instructions are applicable to all interactive and text continuing language models, where the user interface application does not prevent the free formation of prompts. It should be noted that models with less capabilities than GPT-4 often produce more deficient results. There is particularly big difference in multilingualism. GPT 3.5 is equivalent to GPT-4 in most tasks, and the difference is clearly noticeable only in some areas of reasoning and linguistic skill. Let's start, and I just wrote a prompt that was reasonably long. Now GPT-4 then responds by explaining why prompts need to be so long. There must be a priming part that warms up the language model, directs it to produce a certain type of text. Then this actual prompt engineering, in which the prompt is formulated to guide the language model to produce the desired type of answers as efficiently as possible. A prompt is a question or sentence, some kind of instruction. Directing with prompts is very important. It determines what the text will eventually become. And you have to take into account who is the text targeted at, what is the reader's receptive capability, what is the nature, values, or role of the author, what are the topics to be covered, what is the purpose and goals of the text, and this reader's perspective again, what is the reader's expectation. In summary, GPT-4 states that priming and prompt engineering are key in using these models. This is particularly important in the context of organizational communication, where bad messages usually can't be undone. Well, as GPT-4 here states, we will now move on to detailed examples based on the purpose of use next. And we follow these principles given here. Of course, not as heavily as this first time, but try to remember how important good priming is. Whether it's sparring, coming up with ideas, or problem solving, everything requires creativity. My hero of creativity, Jacob Bronowski, the founder of scientific humanism, a physicist and poet, has written several books on the development of science. According to him, creativity is an error in relation to normative thinking, and it means that we find a meaningful connection between two things that were previously considered separate. We investigated this phenomena over 2 years ago with GPT-3 based Samantha. I noticed that it was not particularly creative by itself, but with human assistance, Samantha was very capable of creativity. My role was not to supply the creativity, for instance in problem solving, but rather the description of the problem and encouragement. Language models strive for a kind of coherence. If I supply two things and then claim that they are related in some way and ask to explain how, the model calculates the answer with the least contradictions, and usually the model finds some kind of relationship as the best answer, which then comes out as the winner in the model's calculation. The connecting factor between the moon and an apple could be Newton, or they might start with the same letter in some language, or both might appear in some poem. GPT models easily find these connections, but the search is not exhaustive, and the model might seek solutions through the most obvious framework, as humans are also known to do. Therefore, humans should encourage the search from different frameworks, from the perspective of problem solving in the prompt. Of course, describing the problem is also important so that all the theoretical ways the problem could be solved would become evident to the model. Often, progressing step by step is finding a solution. Now, let's try in practice how this is done. I asked GPT-4 to first comment on my recent explanation and then a couple of riddle-like questions which humans typically find difficult to answer. Here we see how GPT-4 copes. This stuffed animal pushed in the bottle, how can it be retrieved with a handkerchief? The answer is truly perfect. When I tried this same question in Finnish, GPT-4 stumbled. It may be that now I gave a small hint, this time that made answering easier, but for humans the question is actually difficult. And then this boiling water example. How to boil water in a forest with only a knife and matches available. The suggestion to create a cup from birch bark is perfect, but then we should ask GPT to rethink its answer. You can't heat the water with matches only. Similar question in Finnish suggested building a campfire from dry twigs and put the cup to heat in the fire. It does not burn through as it is wet from the inside. There was also an instruction on how to be careful not to harm the nature. Some kind of sparring is certainly necessary. GPT-4 occasionally needs to be informed about the physical world, what all does not work, because it doesn't always have the common sense of the physical world. Dialogues are one important form of teaching. In classroom-based teaching, the dialogue is often between the teacher and the student. In video material, the dialogue is between the recorded characters. In that case, GPT-4 can help in writing one part of the dialogue as a partner with the user or in writing all role speeches. First, I asked to explain a bit of the background of didactics and then to generate a dialogue on the topic. I chose a discussion on the benefits of immediate feedback between a behaviorist and a constructivist. Kurt is here trying what I have often failed at. That is, convincing a constructivist that there is something good in behaviorism too. And of course, Susan responds with this basic idea of constructivists warning against the pitfalls of behaviorism, but this getting the class quiet does appeal to teachers. The tricks teachers use to do it most efficiently are indeed behavioristic. This is my own stance and also Kurt's stance, and it seems that at this point Susan, written by GPT-4, begins to agree to see place for both teachings. This is often the most important contribution in dialogues. Most often it makes sense to start producing text by structuring the topic and approach. This structure is very often worth giving to the language model. ChatGPT usually helps in structuring well. if the topic is at the level of global general knowledge. Let's try next to produce a table of contents for a book that teaches the preparation of healthy and delicious food in a senior home. First, the language model is asked to remind itself of everything to be considered here. And then finally, after the table of contents, to write the back cover blurb. This task is accomplished excellently. Structure is clear and ready to be discussed or proposed to a publisher. GPT-4 is skilled at finding connecting factors between things. Using this feature, it can be asked, for example, to suggest similar or contrasting examples. Recommendation systems typically require these features. They often rely on a broad user base and recommendation material, but GPT-4 is capable in many cases of basing its estimates on general knowledge. This is crucial if recommendation material is not available. Let's see how it suggested books to me based on the favorites I mentioned. And it does well. I've read most of those and enjoyed them very much. I'll have to try the missing ones as well. Now, however, we continue with a more difficult challenge. I continued asking for suggestions on books I should not start reading. It's interesting to see how it finds something common from my favorites, and it seems to know me well based on the books I have read. A complex world is what has fascinated me, and many moral and responsibility questions handled in fantasy, as well as technology's societal impacts on the world. Let's look at these suggestions. I haven't read those, and it really wouldn't occur me to start reading those, except I have read Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code and to some extent enjoyed that type of book. However, not so much that I would read Dan Brown's entire production. 4 out of 5 hit precisely outside my reading circle, so it does well, and there is also a good warning comment. Condensation is a task in which GPT-4 is very good, and GPT 3.5 is also very good. I now asked it to condense a long Yle newspaper article to its essence. Let's see what came out of it. As you just saw from this immediate response, GPT 3.5 is much faster than GPT-4, and all the essentials of the story were included. In most cases, GPT 3.5 performs well enough and is much cheaper to use if you pay for the API. An important way of using language model is related to text editing and proofreading. For example, we can ask GPT to write the text so that it can be understood by a layman or child, but we can also ask GPT to evaluate the text and consider what is missing from it and add the missing deficiencies. At this point, I tried ChatGPT's ability to criticize the earlier debate between a behaviorist and a constructivist. Thus, I continued that conversation asking for criticism. GPT-4 excellently finds missing perspectives, and when necessary, it suggests these to be added. Of course, you can evaluate this topic yourself, What still remains missing from this learning and teaching is an endless topic of discussion. GPT-4 is an excellent speechwriter. When you have it write a speech, you first need to give inspiration and structure, then a bit of goal and ambition into the mix. I have had several speeches written. The most visible was for the World Conference of Future Committees, which Synthesia then performed as Mother Earth. My New Year's speech for this year was written for me by GPT-3 with this same prompt I now give into GPT-4's hands. This speech became a notch finer than the original. Between the beginning and end of Seattle and Kennedy comes a lot of other things. In a beautiful arc, this then ends. So, to Seattle and Kennedy's thoughts, a beautiful framework and all issues neatly handled in a tiny package, appealing and actually quite powerfully presented. And that humor and surprise came in there as well as appeal to what we now have to do ourselves. Language models can easily produce stories. If a theme is given to the story and GPT asked to proceed on its own, the story can easily become quite unremarkable. Language models strive for coherence, meaning the most likely continuations, surprising turns and interesting growth of tensions do not occur quite naturally. They need to be requested. Therefore, it's worth spending a bit of time leading the process. And of course, we can ask GPT to first present different story structures, describe characters, describe possible plot twists. Only after this should you ask for actual storytelling. But remember to pause in between. You can't ask for all at once, because GPT often does not understand what it has written until it gets to read it after a turn change. So you must first request the setup, and only after the background is written can you ask then for the actual story. If you succeed in these groundwork tasks, the story could turn out quite good. From there, GPT starts writing the story, but let's let it continue on its own path without further ado and move on to the next topic. If you wish for sales arguments, you can ask for them and counter arguments for practice quite straightforwardly. The arguments you get may appear too general if the product or service to be sold is not well enough described. Here, I try to ask for sales arguments for a pink car. At the same time, then I ask for possible objections and responses to these counter arguments. I get a bit of an advantage when I start selling the cars. I think this exercise was successful enough that it came to mind, should I buy a pink car myself? In fact, I once had an orange car. The third Beetle in the 1970s was always easily found in the parking lot. You can consider these arguments yourself. How many of these would come to mind if you were trying to think about it in a hurry? A work group, of course, would get a lot more perspectives by meeting, but this is a huge help in ideation in all those situations where a broad human effort cannot be motivated. When asked to do expert work, it is advisable to approach the responses from language models with caution. If it is about assisting work and the user has the ability to assess the reliability of the results themselves, for example, GPT-4 is a useful assistant in both contract drafting, contract negotiation assessment, contract disputes, and drafting regulatory complaints and responses. Initially, it is beneficial to assure the model that it is a lawyer operating in the area whose specialty is the legislation of the contract country. It is essential to guide the model to the necessary legislative framework and the industry and situation in question. After this, it is worth questioning to find out if the subject area is sufficiently familiar, perhaps by asking to recall general principles. If the law or practice is not familiar in some parts, or for example it has changed, you can let GPT-4 read the newest regulation before proceeding. In contract drafting, you can proceed by first describing the most important things to agree on, then asking what other issues could cause disputes or risks to the contracting parties. After this preparation, you can request a contract draft. A contract draft made in this way or received from the other party can be given to the model to read in another session. After initial guidance, asking it to list possible deficiencies and risks and make correcting suggestions. GPT-4 often improves its own work, as humans also do. OpenAI's chief researcher Ilya Sutskever stated in a recent interview that GPT-4 infers quite well when it's allowed to think aloud. This is somewhat related to the same issue that has been noted several times here. It is worth approaching things gradually. Essential boundary conditions and rules of inference, or the basic structures and pitfalls of the issue being considered and planned, should be requested for reading. GPT-4 can produce them itself, and even though it clearly can produce them, it is still useful that it reads them when responding to a related inference task. Here, I first ask the model to recall the basic principles and rules of an important theory, TCE, transaction cost economy, explaining the formation of companies. TCE guides to principles on why it is beneficial to do something in a hierarchy, referring to any organization or firm, or if it is better to buy externally from the market. The theory is widely proven but difficult to interpret. GPT explains the theory and the related rules of the game well, as one might expect. After this, I ask how the rapid development of artificial intelligence affects the size of companies when viewed through the lens of transaction cost theory, which explains company size. GPT-4 is able to consider the consequences of artificial intelligence according to the different rules of the transaction cost theory commendably, and reaches the same conclusion that I, having read extensively on the subject, have also reached. There are reasons why companies can grow, and there are reasons why companies can shrink. Both of these are powerful, which means a lot of changes will occur in the business world, but as for the overall effect, it cannot be said whether companies will grow or shrink on the average. Language models are transformers. GPT comes from generative pre-trained transformer. In practice, this means that they are good at understanding language structures and interpreting ideas linguistically into all forms that are familiar to them. For example, if the model is told in what form instructions should be given to an illustration program, GPT-4 can draft the necessary prompts. In practice, this happens by first explaining the structure of the instruction needed. Next, the model is given the text content to be illustrated and asked for an illustration instruction suitable for illustrating the content. Here, I asked GPT-4 to produce an appropriate illustration instruction for the text I just spoke for Mid-Journey, and it produced an instruction leading to this picture. This result is not as gifted at the idea level in abstract pictures as, for example, DALL-E 2. More comprehensible illustration instructions produce better result. As an example of producing structured textbook material, chapters 2 and 4.1 of this project's documentation serve as examples. They are entirely written by GPT-4. At the level of global general knowledge, GPT-4 is capable of generating textbook-like text, the content of which is predominantly of good quality and the text is clear. Structuring should be done or commissioned before the actual writing work. Writing should be commissioned chapter by chapter or paragraph by paragraph after the entire table of contents, so that GPT-4 has rough understanding at each point of the high-level abstraction what is covered in the chapter to be written. As has been previously stated, the role or character of the writer, their values and level of expertise must be described in such a way that GPT-4 can guess what kind of writer it is. Similarly, the audience must be characterized so that the writer understands who the text is being written for. It is also essential to mention what the learning objective is, so that GPT-4 is able to assess when the text achieves the goal. Language models aim to perform given linguistic tasks. One of the tasks of teaching materials is exercise material. Let's see how well this works, for instance, in mammal identification. The type of task mentioned above and what you see printed here represents the use of artificial intelligence by the teacher. When speaking of artificial intelligence in use by the students, the nature of the tasks should change. In ethics education, for instance, a student could be asked to choose an ethically challenging question and generate a dialogue with ChatGPT in which they clarify the ethical stance related to the problem from the viewpoint of the four main directions of ethics. Another example and exercise method could be that the student would be given a ready first prompt, where the AI is given a character and motive. The student's task would be to continue the conversation in such a way that the AI agrees and accepts the reasons given by the student. Characteristic for these examples is that the student has to show mastery of the whole, control at the level of meaning, and ability to guide the conversation. This cannot be replaced by asking the AI for an answer to some question or a task according to an essay title. This is about a dynamic situation. Often something other than straight text is needed. ChatGPT is good at following instructions and especially good at adapting language to different structures. Writing forms and formulaic strings of characters according to instruction is done well. If the format or formula or syntax, depending on the reference frame, is such that the model doesn't know it, it can be taught by giving the syntax or in a formulaic form and then one or two examples or just examples might suffice. After that, you can give the content and ask to convert it to formulaic form. In this example, ChatGPT knows the format and also remembers the needed planetary information and guides the use of the resulting table. In this case, one must help to the extent of specifying the decimal separator as a comma. When we use English, ChatGPT has no way to find out the settings in Excel unless we supply the parameter settings. First, we got the table in a format that can be directly copied via clipboard and then in CSV file format, which needs to be copy-pasted to Notepad and saved as a CSV file, which can then be opened from Excel. ChatGPT provides instructions for both. Many language models are capable of producing program code. On open source platforms such as GitHub, there is a wealth of applications written in different programming languages with which they have been able to learn. GPT-4 is also quite reasonably able to explain and analyze code. Models make mistakes when coding and don't know all programming environments or take into account all needs, so checking and testing the resulting program code is necessary. Keep in mind that errors in programs can cause a big mess if their testing environment contains data that is difficult to restore. Neglecting cybersecurity seems to be particularly easy for AI coders. The ability of GPT-4 to analyze code comes in handy in these cases because you can ask it to look for defects, risks, and security deficiencies and correct the code if any error situation is encountered and the code does not work as desired. I saved the HTML code in the way recommended by GPT-4 and opened it in a browser. The result was as expected. It appears to be easy even for a novice to create and test simple web pages. After this, we can modify and expand the page into a site or start adding functionality to it. At this point, I will familiarize myself with the suggested environments and install the environment. As a result of a Google search, I considered Python instead of JavaScript because it's more versatile and user experiences indicate that GPT-4 knows it best. On the other hand, JavaScript is simple and works in many different browsers without a separate runtime environment. This makes it a bit safer for the unskilled. JavaScript may need to be allowed in the browser for it to work. My own trial did not require it. Now we have achieved programmed functionality. In addition to the function I requested, GPT-4 made the form so that it remembers the input question and proceeds to the answer only if the question field is not empty. Since this is not an actual programming course, we will not delve extensively into the mysteries of programming, but will next focus on API use. Next, we will extend the forms functionality to the OpenAI API so that the web page user gets an answer to their question from the GPT model. For the application to even theoretically use the GPT model, it must have access to these services. The application can be offered online to its own stakeholders for free, but someone has to pay OpenAI for the use of the API. The payer is identified by an API key that functions as a password. Registered developers have access to the API. The developer can see their own accumulating bill by users on the pages. The main user can generate API key identifiers. These are only shown to the user once, at which point they can be securely saved. If the first API key wasn't saved, more can certainly be created. The API key is given to the application so that it can open a connection to the OpenAI API. The key should not be written directly into the code if the code is visible to others. The exposure of the API key does not cause a complete disaster because a maximum bill can be set in the system, after which use is blocked. Additionally, the exposed API key can be removed. In this case, GPT-4 declined to write the API key directly into the browser code because I did not define that I would use it strictly locally, and it did explain the difficulty and threat. After this, ChatGPT steered me to set up a server. For this, it advised installing Node.js, Express, Axios, and Chorus modules. I asked for further instructions, Googled a bit, and followed the instructions given. I made mistakes. GPT-4 might have made mistakes, but after error messages and often having the code read again, GPT guided me to the finish. A few hours of learning went by. Finally, ChatGPT finished both the functioning browser code and the code for the server. The server is started from Windows PowerShell, and the browser application uses it to access the API service. The API key is now only on the server. This architecture easily allows for example, sharing GPT-3 or GPT-4 with all users, browsers within an organization's internal network with a single API key and a single payer. Some of OpenAI's models can be fine-tuned. This is charged by OpenAI based on the amount of data fed into the model. Training the text DaVinci 3 model at the GPT 3.5 level costs $3 per 100,000 tokens. Using your fine-tuned model costs 16 cents per 1,000 tokens, so it's clearly more expensive to use than the equivalent general model. For simpler tasks, it makes most sense to train smaller models, of which the cheapest ADA is about 100 times more affordable to train and use than text DaVinci 3. Next, ChatGPT explains the process of fine-tuning itself. OpenAI's page guides in detail how the training is practically done. Without sufficiently wide set of data that can be taught to the model, it is not worth trying to experiment on. ChatGPT Plus offers through GPT4 the possibility of so-called plugin extensions. Plugins must first be enabled in Settings beta features. After this, several extensions can be chosen simultaneously as active from the plugin store page in the GPT4 settings. After the plugin installation, GPT4 attempts to identify tasks suitable for extensions from the prompts given to it. If such tasks exist, they are assigned to a suitable extension. For example, the calculation in the example running behind me is directed to be performed by the chosen natural science calculator Wolfram Alpha. GPT-4 first formulates the task into a format that Wolfram Alpha understands, reads its answer, and then edits and combines it into its own output, a response suitable for the user's prompt. Plugin extensions offer an important route for the language model so that if needed, it can receive direct observational data from its environment, the content of the internet, various services of organizations, or, for example, perform reservations, control robots, or use other specialized services which the language model independently cannot perform. The extensions, among other things, substantially improve ChatGPT's ability to answer fact-based questions and tasks requiring complex calculations or corporate databases. This example only illustrates the use of Wolfram Alpha.
Now we have gone through a sizable number of different uses for GPT models. The most important thing to remember is that you can converse with artificial intelligence and guide it. Each situation must be described to it well enough. And you can also ask it for advice and options, from which you can see how different the interpretations of the instructions can be. These can then be used to guide more accurately. Practice makes perfect in this as well.